Millionaire pretends to be blind to test the honesty of the waitress, but what she did left him speechless. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of melting butter on toast as Emily walked through the double doors of the kitchen at Flavors of Portugal, located in the heart of Brooklyn, New York. Her hurried footsteps echoed across the Portuguese tile floor as she adjusted her impeccably pressed white apron, a gift from her grandmother Eleanor on her first day of work nearly 2 years ago. "Good morning, family," she exclaimed with her characteristic smile, one that not only lit up her face but seemed to warm the entire room. The other staff members responded in unison, already accustomed to the contagious energy she brought every morning, no matter the challenges she faced in her personal life. Emily began her routine by checking each table, ensuring the white linen, tablecloths were perfectly aligned, and that the silverware sparkled like tiny mirrors under the light streaming through the large windows of the main dining room. In her small, well-worn notebook, she jotted down the day's specials prepared by Chef Michael, memorizing each ingredient and preparation method so she could describe them to customers with the passion of someone who truly knows what they're serving. As she put the finishing touches on the restaurant before opening, her mind wandered to the small apartment in the Bronx where her grandmother Eleanor rested. The worry about her grandmother's worsening arthritis over the past few months weighed heavily on her heart, but Emily knew she couldn't let it get her down. It was for Eleanor, after all, that she worked so tirelessly, splitting her time between long shifts at the restaurant and night classes for her technical degree in administration. The sound of the front doorbell announced the first customer of the day, pulling Emily from her thoughts. It was exactly 8 in the morning, the time the restaurant opened for breakfast, a tradition that attracted both executives from the nearby financial district and locals who appreciated Portuguese cuisine. "Good morning. Welcome to Flavors of Portugal," Emily greeted automatically, turning to welcome the customer. Her cheerful voice faltered for a moment when her eyes met the imposing figure who had just entered. A tall man around 45 years old, wearing an impeccably tailored suit, sunglasses, and a white cane. The man moved with some hesitation, and Emily quickly understood the situation. Without wasting a second, she approached with soft steps, announcing her presence with a clear and gentle voice. "Allow me to help you to a table, sir. We have an excellent spot by the window where the temperature is more pleasant this morning." "Thank you very much," he replied in a deep and polite voice, accepting the assistance offered by Emily. She guided him carefully, describing the path they were taking. "We'll take 3 steps forward and then turn slightly to the right. The table is just 2 more steps ahead." After seating him comfortably, Emily began to describe the surroundings. "The menu is in front of you, but I'd be happy to go over all our options. Today we have some Portuguese specialties that I'm sure you'll enjoy. By the way, my name is Emily, and it will be a pleasure to serve you." What Emily couldn't imagine was that behind those dark glasses, the eyes of Edward Anderson, one of New York's most influential businessmen, were watching her intently. His apparent visual impairment was nothing more than an elaborate ruse, a social experiment he had decided to conduct after years of disillusionment with the insincerity of people who surrounded him for their own gain. The young waitress began, describing each item on the menu with a genuine enthusiasm that surprised Edward. She didn't just list the ingredients, but shared little stories about each dish, especially the Portuguese recipes that, according to her, reminded her of the ones her grandmother used to make. "Our sponge cake is prepared following a traditional Portuguese recipe that's over 3 generations old," she explained with evident pride. "The batter is so light it feels like it's floating, and the vanilla aroma blends perfectly with the Sicilian lemon notes we've added to the original recipe." Edward realized there was something special about this waitress. It wasn't just her kindness in dealing with someone she believed to be visually impaired, but the way she turned a simple breakfast into a unique experience, rich in details and care that went far beyond her professional duties. As he savored the coffee prepared exactly as she had suggested, Edward discreetly listened to Emily's interactions with other customers who were starting to arrive. For each one, she maintained the same level of attention and cordiality. Always, with a sincere smile in her voice that he could sense even without seeing. In the following weeks, Edward became a regular customer at Flavors of Portugal, always arriving at the same time and requesting the same table. Emily, in turn, developed a special routine to serve him, preparing the table in advance and memorizing the new items on the menu to describe them accurately. One particularly busy morning, while serving Edward his breakfast, Emily shared a story about her grandmother Eleanor. "You know, Mr. Edward, my grandmother always said that the secret to a good custard tart isn't just in the recipe, but in the love and dedication we put into every step of the process. She taught me that the dough must rest for exactly the right amount of time, not a minute more, not a minute less." Edward noticed how her eyes sparkled as she spoke about her grandmother and the traditional recipes. During his visits, he discovered that Emily kept a special notebook where she wrote down all the family recipes, some so old that the yellowed pages threatened to fall apart. "Today I brought something special for you to try," Emily said one morning, gently placing a small package on the table. "These are cinnamon cookies I made following my grandmother's recipe. I thought you might like to feel the unique texture they have." The unexpected gesture took Edward by surprise. He realized that this young woman not only cared about doing her job well, but also about creating genuine connections with the people she served. The cookies, he noticed, were perfectly wrapped, in delicate paper, with a small card where the name of the treat could be felt in raised letters. During his discreet observations, Edward also witnessed how Emily handled challenging situations. On one occasion, a particularly difficult customer complained about the coffee, claiming it was cold. Without losing her composure, she not only provided a new cup, but also offered a small sweet as a courtesy, turning a tense moment into a positive experience. What impressed Edward the most was how Emily managed her time. Through casual conversations, he discovered that she attended a technical course in administration every night after long days at the restaurant. Even so, he never saw her show signs of fatigue or impatience. "Do you believe in dreams?" she asked one morning as she served his coffee. "I have one that might seem simple to many, but to me, it means the world. I want to open a small artisanal bakery where I can keep my family's recipes alive and create a welcoming space where every customer feels at home." Edward listened attentively as she described her dream in precise detail. The wooden shelves that would display fresh bread, the scent of cinnamon and coffee that would fill the air, the small tables where customers could savor Portuguese treats while chatting. It was clear that every detail had been carefully thought out and planned. Between sips of coffee, Edward also observed how Emily interacted with her co-workers. She always found time to help new employees, teaching them not just the practical tasks, but also sharing her techniques for memorizing the orders and preferences of regular customers. The businessman noticed that she maintained her own organizational system with little notes about the tastes of each frequent customer. "Mr. John always orders his coffee with an extra touch of cinnamon," she explained to a new waitress, "and Mrs. Mary prefers her toast extra golden. It's the small details that make the difference." During a quieter moment, Emily confided in Edward about her grandmother's situation. "You know, she's been facing some health issues lately. Her arthritis is getting worse, and the doctors have recommended specialized treatment. That's why I've been making extra pastries to sell on my days off. Every little bit helps." That revelation deeply touched Edward. Here was a young woman who, even while facing considerable challenges, maintained unwavering integrity and dedication. She not only dreamed of a better future, but worked tirelessly to build it, never compromising her values or the quality of her work. The news hit Flavors of Portugal like a bombshell on a rainy Monday morning. Mr. Antonio, the restaurant's owner, for over 2 decades, gathered all the staff before opening. His heavy expression betrayed that something was wrong. "My dear friends," he began, his voice trembling, "the past few months have not been easy for our restaurant. The competition from new establishments in the neighborhood and rising costs have put us in a delicate situation." But he paused as if searching for the strength to continue. "Unfortunately, I will have to cut our team in half." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily looked around, observing the worried faces of her colleagues. She saw Mrs. Carmen, who had worked in the kitchen for 15 years and was single-handedly supporting 2 children in college. She thought of John, the young assistant who had just rented his first apartment. Each person there had their own story, their own needs, their own dreams. That same morning, Edward arrived at his usual time, immediately sensing the change in the restaurant's atmosphere. Emily greeted him with her usual kindness, but he noticed a slight tremble in her normally steady voice. "Did something happen?" he asked, pretending not to notice the tense atmosphere just from the sounds and feelings. Emily hesitated for a moment before responding, "It's just a few changes at the restaurant, Mr. Anderson. But don't worry, we'll continue to offer the same service as always." Her voice carried a determination that impressed Edward. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, an idea was beginning to form in Emily's mind. During her lunch break, she gathered all the staff in the service area. Her small notebook was open on the table, filled with calculations and sketches. "I know the situation is tough," she began, "but maybe we can find a solution together. What if we created a rotation system? We could reorganize our schedules, split some shifts. That way, no one would have to be laid off." The proposal sparked a long discussion. Some employees would have to reduce their hours, others would need to be more flexible with their schedules, but the alternative was losing their jobs entirely. Emily worked tirelessly on the details of the plan, using the knowledge she was gaining in her management course. Meanwhile, Edward continued his daily visits, increasingly impressed by Emily's poise. He watched her coordinating the changes at the restaurant with a surprising maturity for someone so young. One morning, he accidentally left a generous tip on the table. "Mr. Anderson." Emily caught up to him on the sidewalk, slightly out of breath. "You left too much money on the table. It's almost $500. "It wasn't a mistake," he replied softly. "The service deserves it." "That's very kind of you," she said, still holding the money out toward him. "But I can't accept it. It wouldn't be fair to my colleagues who work just as hard. If you'd like, you can split the tip among the entire team." That attitude left Edward even more intrigued. In all his years as a businessman, he had rarely encountered someone with such integrity. He decided then to expand his test. In the following weeks, the restaurant began to show signs of recovery. The rotation system proposed by Emily not only saved jobs, but also brought a new energy to the establishment. The staff was more united, collaborating with each other in ways never seen before. At home, however, Emily faced growing challenges. Her grandmother Eleanor needed to start a specialized treatment that would cost far more than her income allowed. During her days off, she ramped up her production of sweets to sell, turning the small kitchen of her apartment into a true factory of Portuguese delights. Edward, always attentive, began placing increasingly larger orders for Emily's sweets, saying they were for events at a community center for the visually impaired. In fact, he distributed them in his companies where the treats became so popular that they started being requested for corporate events. Emily's recipe blog began as a simple project, born from her lonely nights after her business administration course. Between the pages of her study notebook, she carefully typed out her grandmother's old recipes, accompanied by family stories and cherished memories that gave each dish a special life. Pastel de Belém, more than a recipe, a love story, was the title of her first post. In it, Emily shared how her great-grandmother had learned to make the traditional Portuguese pastry in a small Lisbon bakery before immigrating to Brazil. The post, written with such care and detail, began circulating among cooking groups on social media. One particularly busy morning at the restaurant, Emily was surprised by a customer who recognized her. "You're the girl from the Flavors of Memory blog, right? I made your orange and almond cake last week. It was divine." Edward, sitting at his usual table, listened with growing interest. Emily's blog was gaining a small but dedicated audience, especially among people who, like her, valued the preservation of culinary traditions. "I've been following your blog," commented a Portuguese lady one afternoon as Emily served her tea. "Your stories remind me so much of my homeland. Did you know that the codfish recipe you posted is exactly like the one my mother used to make in Coimbra?" What started as a hobby was turning into something bigger. Emily spent her free time responding to comments, exchanging experiences with her readers, and adapting old recipes to more accessible ingredients in Brazil, always keeping the traditional essence of the dishes. Her grandmother Eleanor, despite her physical limitations, helped by recalling recipe details and sharing stories that Emily turned into engaging blog posts. It was a way to keep not only the family culture alive, but also to strengthen the bond between grandmother and granddaughter even more. It was during one of these reminiscing sessions that Eleanor had an idea. "Emily, why don't we make a Braille cookbook? That way people who can't see could also cook our recipes." The suggestion deeply touched Emily, who immediately thought of her client Edward. In the following weeks, she began researching Braille printing and adapting recipes for the visually impaired. Her already scarce savings were invested in a project she wasn't entirely sure would succeed. Meanwhile, the success of the pastries she sold to Edward began to draw attention. One day, she received an unexpected call from a businessman in the food industry who had tasted her custard tarts at a corporate event. "Miss Emily," he said, in a professional tone, "we are interested in commercializing your recipes on a large scale. We can adapt production to supply supermarkets and major bakery chains. Naturally, some adjustments will be necessary to reduce costs and increase product shelf life." The offer was tempting, especially considering the rising expenses for her grandmother's treatment. Her waitress salary barely covered basic needs, and the pastry sales, though steady, weren't enough to secure a solid financial cushion. However, something about the term "adapt production" deeply unsettled Emily. She knew it would mean giving up the artisanal quality, the careful preparation process her grandmother had taught her. It would mean swapping natural ingredients for preservatives, abandoning traditional techniques in favor of mass production. Edward, who continued his daily visits, noticed a subtle change in Emily's behavior. She seemed more pensive, less expansive in her descriptions of the dishes. One morning, he decided to ask her about it. "Sometimes," she began, pouring the coffee he so enjoyed, "we have to choose between the easier path and the right one. You know, Mr. Edward, I received an offer to market my recipes on a large scale, but that would mean losing the essence of what I do. Every dessert I make carries a story, a piece of my family. I can't turn that into just another product on the supermarket shelf." Those words hit Edward with surprising force. Here was someone who, even while facing considerable financial difficulties, refused to compromise her values. It was exactly the kind of person he had stopped believing existed. The small apartment in the Bronx was filled with papers of different textures scattered across the kitchen table. Emily spent her nights studying Braille printing techniques, experimenting with different types of embossing that could work in a recipe book. Her grandmother Eleanor, sitting in her favorite armchair, watched her granddaughter's efforts with pride. "Grandma, I think I finally got it," exclaimed Emily one night after weeks of attempts. She had developed a system of raised markings that indicated not only the ingredients and quantities, but also the arrangement of utensils on the counter and the positioning of hands during the preparation of the recipes. The Braille cookbook project was consuming a large part of her savings, but Emily felt she was on the right path. During her breaks at the restaurant, she took notes on the different textures of foods and how to describe them in a way that made sense to someone with visual impairments. One particularly busy morning, Emily received news that would completely change her plans. The chef of a renowned restaurant in Beverly Hills had tasted her desserts at an event and was impressed. The job offer came with a salary 3 times higher than what she earned at Flavors of Portugal. "Think carefully, Emily," insisted the chef during a phone call. "With your experience and talent, you could grow a lot in our establishment. We have an extremely demanding clientele that values contemporary Portuguese cuisine." The offer couldn't have come at a better time. Her grandmother's treatment was becoming increasingly expensive, and the expenses for the Braille book project were starting to weigh on her budget. Yet something deeply bothered her about the idea of leaving Flavors of Portugal. Edward, who continued his daily visits, noticed that something was troubling Emily. Her descriptions of the dishes, usually so enthusiastic, seemed more restrained that morning. "Is everything okay?" he asked, with genuine concern in his voice. Emily hesitated for a moment before sharing her thoughts. "You know, Mr. Edward, sometimes life presents us with paths that seem perfect on paper, but don't align with who we truly are. I received an incredible job offer, with a salary that would solve many of my problems, but, encouraged Edward, interested in her response. But this place, these people, are so much more than just a job to me. Every customer I serve here has a story I know, preferences I've memorized. I can't imagine myself working in a place where people are just numbers on a bill." That night, after her shift, Emily stayed longer at the restaurant, watching the street activity through the large windows. Her co-workers were more than just employees. They were a family that had grown even closer after the crisis that nearly led to mass layoffs. Mrs. Carmen approached, noticing her thoughtful expression. "We heard about the offer, dear," she said softly. "No one here will judge you if you accept. We all know how much you dedicate yourself to your grandmother." Mrs. Carmen's words struck a chord with Emily. It was true that the extra money would make a significant difference in her life, especially now with the additional expenses. But as she thought about it, her hands touched the small notebook where she jotted down customers' preferences, the stories they shared, and the smiles they exchanged every morning. It was at that moment that Emily had an idea that would change not only her life, but also the lives of everyone around her. Grabbing her notebook, she began to jot down frantic notes. Her business administration course and her experience with the recipe blog had taught her about market niches and untapped opportunities. What if, she thought aloud, I could bring all of this together? The Portuguese tradition, accessibility for the visually impaired, the personalized service we offer here. Her mind worked quickly, developing a plan that seemed too ambitious but made perfect sense in her heart. The next morning, Emily arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. She had spent much of the night developing her idea and could hardly wait to share it with Edward, who had become not only a loyal customer, but also a confidant she fully trusted. The sun had barely risen when Emily finished organizing her improvised presentation. On Edward's table, she had arranged not only the usual breakfast items, but also some samples of her Braille project. Test pages with adapted recipes, labels with raised flavor descriptions, and even some special packaging she had developed for her sweets. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she greeted him as soon as he arrived at his usual time. "Today I've prepared something special for you. In fact, I'd like to share an idea, if you'll allow me." Edward, intrigued by the change in routine, nodded with a subtle smile. Emily began explaining her project with the enthusiasm he so admired in her. "I've been working on a bakery concept that goes beyond the traditional, a place where Portuguese cuisine meets accessibility, where every customer, regardless of their limitations, can have a complete experience with food." As she spoke, she guided Edward's hands over the different textures she had created. "See, I've developed a Braille identification system for each type of sweet. The packaging has different raised patterns that indicate not only the flavor, but also the main ingredients and even pairing suggestions." Edward was genuinely impressed by the level of detail and care in the project. Every element had been thought out, not just from a commercial standpoint, but primarily from the perspective of inclusion and respect for traditions. "But that's not all," Emily continued, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I want to create a space where people with visual impairments can work, where they can develop their skills in the kitchen safely and with dignity. A place where traditional Portuguese recipes are not only preserved, but also made accessible to everyone." As he listened to Emily's presentation, Edward felt his heart tighten. The ruse he had created, initially intended as a character test, had turned into something much greater. The young waitress had not only demonstrated genuine kindness in her treatment of him, but had transformed that experience into a project that could benefit countless people. Emily continued sharing her plans, showing cost spreadsheets she had developed during her technical course, marketing strategies she had learned from her blog, and even a small market study she had conducted on her own. "I know it might seem like a very big dream," she admitted, her voice softening. "But I learned from my grandmother that dreams are like bread dough. They need time to grow, care to develop, but with the right ingredients and a lot of dedication, they always work out." Edward realized that the moment he had long feared had arrived. He would need to reveal his true identity. Emily's honesty and commitment to her project deserved nothing less than total sincerity from him. However, before he could speak, something unexpected happened. "Mr. Edward," said Emily, pulling a small package from her bag. "This is the first official product from my future bakery." She placed a delicately decorated box in his hands, with Braille inscriptions on the top. "It's a special pastel de nata, with a raised base that allows you to identify the correct position to hold and bite, ensuring that everyone can enjoy the pastry in the ideal way." That gesture, so simple yet so meaningful, was the final straw for Edward. Emily's dedication to creating an inclusive experience, even without resources or support, demonstrated a level of entrepreneurship and humanity he had rarely encountered in his years in business. The moment Edward had long feared had arrived. Holding the specially adapted pastel de nata that Emily had handed him, he felt the weight of months of deception on his shoulders. With a slow and deliberate motion, he removed the sunglasses he had worn for so long as part of his charade. "Emily," he began, his voice deeper than usual, "I need to tell you something important." He placed the glasses on the table and looked directly at her for the first time, with no barriers between them. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily remained still, her eyes fixed on Edward's, trying to process what was happening. The cane, which had been leaning against the side of the table, now seemed like a strange and out-of-place object. "I'm not who you think I am," continued Edward, keeping his gaze steady. "My real name is Edward Anderson, and I'm the CEO of the Anderson Investment Group. I'm not visually impaired. All of this was a test, a social experiment I started a few months ago." Emily felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her hands, always steady while serving tables, trembled slightly as she held her tray. Memories of the past. Few months flashed through her mind like a high-speed movie. All the detailed descriptions she had given of the dishes, the special care she had taken to guide him, the stories she had shared thinking she was helping a customer with special needs. "A test?" she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "All this time, you were testing me?" Edward noticed the pain in her voice and hurried to explain, "It wasn't my intention to hurt anyone. After years of dealing with self-serving and fake people, I decided to create this persona to observe how people truly are when they think they can't gain anything in return." Emily carefully placed the tray on the table, needing to steady herself for a moment. Her gaze wandered around the restaurant, passing by the customers enjoying their breakfast, oblivious to the drama unfolding, and her co-workers watching her with curiosity before returning to the man in front of her. "And all those dessert orders?" she asked, starting to piece things together. "The community center for the visually impaired." "I distributed your sweets in my companies," admitted Edward. "They were so successful that they started being requested for corporate events. But every penny I paid for them was because they are truly worth it, Emily. Your dedication, your talent, they are genuine." The young waitress took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Part of her wanted to scream, to feel betrayed, but another part was beginning to understand the bigger picture of that situation. Her Braille book project, her idea of an inclusive bakery, all had come from her interaction with Edward. "Why? Are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its usual firmness. Edward picked up the adapted pastel de nata she had handed him moments before. "Because of this," he said, turning the packaging in his hands. "Because of your project, your dedication to creating something truly inclusive. You turned what was supposed to be just a test into something meaningful, something that can make a difference in the lives of many people." He paused, watching as Emily processed his words. "When you presented your project to me today, I realized I couldn't continue with this charade. Your dream is too big, too important to be built on a lie." Emily slowly sat down in the chair across from Edward, something she had never done before during her work. Her eyes fell on her small notebook, where she had recorded so many ideas and dreams over the past few weeks. "And now?" she asked, more to herself than to Edward. "The entire project I developed, all the adaptations I created to help people, With visual impairments, do they still make sense? Are they still valid? Edward leaned forward, his face showing a seriousness Emily had never seen before. They make more sense than ever, he stated with conviction. In fact, I have a proposal. For you, Emily. A proposal that could turn your dream into reality. Edward Anderson's office on the top floor of a towering commercial building offered a panoramic view of New York. Emily gazed at the city through the large windows, still trying to process the events of the last 48 hours. Her life had completely changed since the revelation at the restaurant. "Please have a seat," said Edward, gesturing to a comfortable armchair in front of his desk. On it were scattered various documents, including the notes Emily had made about her inclusive bakery project. "I've spent the last 2 days thoroughly analyzing your proposal," he began, picking up a few sheets of paper. "Your market research, though preliminary, shows untapped potential. But what impressed me the most was how you managed to blend tradition and innovation in such a unique way." Emily adjusted herself in the chair, feeling oddly out of place in that corporate environment. It was different from the comforting familiarity of flavors of Portugal, but there was something about the way Edward conducted the conversation that made her feel more at ease. "As a businessman," he continued, "I've seen many business opportunities over the years, but rarely have I come across a project that combines social responsibility with commercial viability so naturally." He picked up one of the adapted packages Emily had developed, examining the embossed details and Braille inscriptions. "This isn't just a product, Emily. It's a revolution in how we think about the culinary experience for people with visual impairments. But I still have so much to learn," admitted Emily, her humility evident. "The Braille book project is still in its early stages, and adapting all the recipes will take time." Edward smiled, pulling a folder from his drawer. "That's why I prepared this proposal. The Anderson Group is interested in being your partner in this venture, not just as an investor, but as a strategic partner that can help turn your dream into reality." He opened the folder, revealing a detailed business plan. "I envision a network of artisanal bakeries that maintain the essence of Portuguese recipes, but with a unique edge, full accessibility. Each store will be designed with inclusion in mind, from customer service to the overall shopping experience." Emily flipped through the documents, her eyes widening at the numbers and projections. It was much bigger than she had initially imagined. "But," interrupted Edward, noticing her expression, "I want you to maintain full creative control, no mass production or compromising on quality. Each recipe will continue to be prepared by hand, following the traditions your grandmother taught you." "What about the staff?" asked Emily, recalling a crucial part of her original plan. "That's the best part," Edward replied enthusiastically. "We'll create a training program for people with visual impairments. They'll be trained not just to work in the bakeries, but to become true culinary professionals." Emily felt her eyes well up. It was exactly what she had dreamed of, but on a scale she had never imagined possible. "Besides," Edward continued, "your blog, Flavors of Memory, will be transformed into a full platform with audio and Braille versions of the recipes. We can create a community where people share their own stories and adaptations of traditional recipes." Emily's mind was spinning with possibilities. Her small dream of an artisanal bakery was turning into something much bigger, something that could truly make a difference in many people's lives. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice soft but firm. "With all the resources you have, why choose to invest in my project?" Edward stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Because you made me believe again in the genuineness of people, Emily. When I started my social experiment, I was skeptical, disillusioned, but you not only proved me wrong, you turned my charade into something meaningful and important." The aroma of cinnamon and fresh coffee filled the small experimental kitchen where Emily and her team had been working for hours. It was the 10th day of testing to adapt traditional recipes to the new concept of the inclusive bakery. On the counter, various packaging prototypes with Braille markings awaited evaluation. "Emily, you need to see this," exclaimed Marina. One of the visually impaired consultants who had been hired to assist in product development. Her hands skillfully explored the different textures of a cake package. The marking to identify the lid is perfect, but I think we can improve the indication of the filling layers. Emily's transformation from waitress to entrepreneur had not been easy. Her mornings, once dedicated to serving at Flavors of Portugal, were now filled with meetings, product testing, and training sessions. Edward had insisted she take an intensive business management course in addition to keeping up with her technical classes. At home, her grandmother Eleanor watched the changes with a mix of pride and concern. One evening, as Emily organized her notes on the kitchen table, the Portuguese woman decided to share her thoughts. "My dear," Eleanor began, sitting beside her granddaughter, "I am so happy to see your dream coming to life, but I can't help but notice the tiredness in your eyes. Have you been eating properly? Have you been resting enough?" And Emily smiled, taking her grandmother's hands in hers. The specialized treatment that Eleanor was now receiving, thanks to Edward's financial support, was working wonders for her health. Her pain had decreased significantly, allowing her to return to doing small tasks in the kitchen. "Don't worry, Grandma," Emily replied, though her dark circles told a different story. "It's just an adjustment phase. There's so much to learn, so many details to sort out." Her mind wandered to the meeting she had earlier with the team of architects. The project for the first bakery was taking shape. A cozy space with specific areas for adapted cooking workshops, a Braille recipe library, and a cafe where every detail would be designed to provide an inclusive experience. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Some traditional suppliers were resistant to the necessary adaptations in their packaging. Others questioned the feasibility of maintaining artisanal production on a larger scale. Emily constantly had to defend her vision of not compromising the quality and authenticity of the recipes. One afternoon, while overseeing the development of a new ingredient identification system, Emily received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Carmen, her former colleague from Flavors of Portugal, showed up carrying a box of sweets. "These are the last ones we made following your recipe," she explained, emotional. "The restaurant isn't the same without you, Emily, but we're all so proud to see how far you've come." Those words touched Emily deeply. Despite all the changes in her life, the memories of the restaurant still warmed her heart. It was there that her dream began to take shape. Among the tables with white tablecloths and the clinking of coffee cups. "You know what I miss the most," Emily confided to Mrs. Carmen. "The customers' stories, the conversations during breakfast, seeing the happiness on people's faces when they tasted something special." At that moment, an idea began to form in her mind. Grabbing her ever-present notebook, Emily started writing frantically. It wasn't just about creating an affordable bakery, it was about keeping alive that feeling of connection, of family, that she had experienced at the restaurant. "Mrs. Carmen," she said, her eyes shining with renewed enthusiasm, "you've just given me an amazing idea. What do you think about joining our team? We need people who truly understand the value of personalized service, who know how to create genuine connections with customers." The proposal took her former colleague by surprise, but before she could respond, they were interrupted by Marina, who brought news about the packaging tests. Emily's day was far from over, but now she had a new purpose in mind: to create not just an accessible space, but a true gathering place where people could feel truly welcomed. The day of the launch of the first Braille recipe book was approaching, and Emily's temporary office was filled with samples of special paper and print proofs. On the wall, a large calendar marked the countdown to the opening of the first bakery, scheduled to happen in less than 2 months. "I think we've found the sweet spot," said Peter, one of the blind consultants working on the book project. His fingers gently traced the pages, feeling each raised detail, each carefully adapted instruction. "The instructions for folding the pastry dough for the pastel de nata are perfectly clear now." Emily watched Peter's reactions closely, jotting notes in her notebook. The book had turned into a much larger project than she had initially imagined. Beyond the Braille recipes, it included stories about the origin of each dish, kitchen safety tips for people with visual impairments, and even a tactile glossary of textures and aromas. "Emily," her assistant called from the doorway. "Mr. Edward is here for the meeting about the training program." Over the past few months, the relationship between Emily and Edward had evolved from a professional partnership into a genuine friendship. The businessman, once skeptical and wary, now showed himself to be a passionate enthusiast for the project, always bringing new ideas and suggestions. "Good morning, Emily," Edward greeted as he entered the room with a folder under his arm. "I've brought some updates about the training program. We've secured partnerships with 3 institutes specializing in visual impairment. They're going to help us structure the vocational training." The news was excellent. The training program was one of the most important parts of the project for Emily. It wasn't just about employing people with visual impairments, but creating real opportunities for professional development. "Edward," Emily began, picking up one of the book samples, "I've been thinking, what if we expanded the concept? Beyond bakeries, we could create a culinary training center for inclusive gastronomy, a place where people with different types of disabilities could learn not just how to cook, but how to become professionals in the field." Edward's eyes lit up at the suggestion. It was exactly this kind of vision that had drawn him to the project in the first place. "Tell me more," he encouraged, grabbing his own notebook. Emily began to enthusiastically share her idea. "Imagine a space where we offer fully adapted culinary courses, where students can learn everything from basic techniques to haute cuisine, with methodologies developed specifically for different needs. We could partner with traditional culinary schools, create exchange programs." As she spoke, Emily realized how much her life had changed in recent months. From the small dream of having an artisanal bakery, she was now planning a project that could impact the lives of hundreds of people. The waitress who lovingly described dishes to a supposedly blind customer had transformed into a social entrepreneur. "You know," said Edward, after making several notes, "when I started that social experiment at the restaurant, I was looking for proof of people's insincerity. But what I found through you was something far more valuable. The ability we have to turn small acts of kindness into meaningful change." Emily smiled, remembering how it all began. "Sometimes I think I should be grateful for that charade," she admitted. "If it weren't for it, I might never have realized how much we can do to make the world more accessible and welcoming." The conversation was interrupted by Marina, who entered the room carrying a tray with samples of freshly baked bread. "Emily, I need you to try these new recipes. We adapted your grandmother's traditional rye bread recipe to make it easier for people with visual impairments to prepare." The familiar aroma of fresh bread filled the room, bringing back memories of flavors of Portugal. Emily picked up a still warm piece, feeling the perfect texture of the crust. It was exactly how her grandmother used to make it, but now this tradition could be shared with a much larger audience. The night before, the opening of the first Flavors and Senses location was filled with emotions and last-minute preparations. Emily stayed in the kitchen of the new bakery, personally overseeing the preparation of the dough that would rest overnight to be baked the next morning. The space, located on a charming corner in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, was far more than she had ever dreamed. The walls in soft tones featured different textures that aided in spatial orientation. Braille signs identified each section, and a tactile map near the entrance allowed visually impaired customers to familiarize themselves with the entire layout of the establishment. "Emily, it's already past 10 at night," warned Marina, who had become her right-hand woman over the past few months. "You need to rest for tomorrow." But Emily could hardly contain her energy. Every inch of that place carried a piece of her story. In the main area, specially designed tables allowed easy access for wheelchair users. The service counter had varying heights to comfortably accommodate all customers. On the walls alongside the Braille signs, there were embossed photographs that told the story of Portuguese cuisine. "Just a few more minutes," she replied, checking the temperature of the fermentation chamber once more, where dozens of loaves rested. "I want to make sure everything will be perfect for tomorrow." In a special corner of the bakery, a small exhibit recounted the history of the establishment. There were photos of the old flavors of Portugal, including one where Emily was seen serving Edward during his days as a blind customer. The idea for the exhibition had come from him, who insisted on keeping alive the memory of how it all began. The sound of familiar footsteps caught Emily's attention. Her grandmother Eleanor, leaning on a new but still elegant cane, entered the kitchen accompanied by Mrs. Carmen, who was now the training supervisor for the team. "My dear," said Eleanor, her eyes shining with emotion, "I came to bring something special for tomorrow." In her hands was a small worn notebook, which Emily immediately recognized as the family's old recipe book. "Grandma, I thought I had lost this notebook," exclaimed Emily, carefully taking the precious object. "It was stored in an old box," explained Eleanor. "I thought tomorrow would be the perfect time for it to come back into action. After all, it was with these recipes that everything began." Emily flipped through the notebook tenderly, recognizing her grandmother's delicate handwriting. Those yellowed pages contained much more than recipes. They held family stories, memories of shared moments in the kitchen, dreams passed down from generation to generation. "I also brought this," continued Eleanor, pulling a small package from her bag. Inside was a white apron, the same one she had given Emily on her first day at Flavors of Portugal. "I had something special embroidered on it." With teary eyes, Emily unfolded the apron. There, delicately embroidered, was the new logo of Flavors and Senses, and below in Braille the words, "Every dream begins with a first step." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Edward, who was accompanied by Peter and other members of the consulting team. "Sorry for the late hour," he said, "but we needed to do one last accessibility test before tomorrow." Peter moved confidently through the space, testing each tactile element, each Braille marking. "Everything is perfect, Emily," he declared with a smile. "Every detail has been so carefully thought out that anyone, regardless of their condition, will feel at home here." Emily observed the group gathered there. Her grandmother, who had taught her the value of traditions, Mrs. Carmen, who represented her connection to the past at the restaurant, Marina and Peter, who had transformed her project into something truly inclusive, and Edward, the man whose deceit had ironically paved the way for the realization of a dream much bigger than she had ever imagined. "Tomorrow," said Edward, picking up one of the bread samples to smell its aroma, "we're not just opening her bakery, we're opening the doors to a new concept of accessibility and inclusion in gastronomy." Emily agreed, feeling the weight and responsibility of that moment. Flavors and Senses would not just be a commercial establishment, but a space of transformation, where differences would be celebrated and traditions preserved in a unique and special way. The sun had barely risen when the scent of fresh bread began to spread through the street. Emily, wearing the embroidered apron her grandmother had given her the night before, oversaw the final preparations for the opening of Flavors and Senses. The team, mostly composed of people with visual impairments, worked in perfect harmony as if they had been doing it their whole lives. "The first loaves are already coming out of the oven," announced Marina, navigating naturally through the kitchen equipment. The organizational system they had developed allowed each person to know exactly where to find what they needed, regardless of their visual condition. Outside, a small crowd was already beginning to gather. The buzz of anticipation could be heard through the walls. Local media was present, drawn by the innovative proposal of a fully inclusive bakery that did not compromise on artisanal quality. "Emily," called Edward, who had just arrived, "do you have a moment? There are a few people I'd like you to meet." He led her to a group of people who had just arrived. They were representatives of visual impairment associations from all over Brazil, some of whom had traveled from far away to celebrate the opening. Among them was a woman Emily recognized immediately from the video conferences, Mrs. Bernice, a retired chef who had lost her sight and had become an invaluable consultant during the project's development. "My dear," said Mrs. Bernice, embracing, "Emily, you have no idea how much this project means to our community. It's not just a bakery, it's proof that it's possible to create truly inclusive spaces without compromising excellence." At exactly 9 o'clock, the long-awaited moment arrived. Emily, accompanied by her grandmother Eleanor, Edward, and the entire team, stood in front of the doors. The audience waited eagerly, including many familiar faces from the old flavors of Portugal. "Welcome, everyone, to Flavors and Senses," Emily began, her voice trembling with emotion. This space was born from a simple dream: to create a place where everyone could experience the magic of traditional Portuguese cuisine, regardless of their physical limitations. The doors opened, and the audience began to enter, marveling at every detail. Visually impaired customers explored the space independently, guided by the different textures on the floor and braille descriptions. The aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air, creating a warm and familiar atmosphere. In the cafe area, Mrs. Carmen served the first customers with the same care and affection Emily had come to admire at Flavors of Portugal. The tables quickly filled with people tasting traditional Portuguese recipes, now presented in a way that was accessible to all. In a particularly touching moment, Emily watched a group of blind children participating in a bread-making workshop, their small hands discovering the texture of the dough under Peter's patient guidance. The smiles on their faces were living proof that they were on the right path. Eleanor, seated in a place of honor near the main counter, couldn't hold back tears of joy as she saw her old recipe book come to life in a way she had never imagined. The recipes she had brought from Portugal, passed down through generations in her family, were now accessible to a much larger audience. Edward, discreetly observing everything from a corner, felt a satisfaction unlike any he had experienced in his years as a businessman. His social experiment had turned into something much bigger than himself, something that truly made a difference in people's lives. At the end of that historic morning, as the last customers left carrying bags of bread and pastries, Emily gathered her team for a moment of celebration. Looking at each face present, she realized she had created much more than a business. She had built a family, a place where differences were celebrated and where each person could be exactly who they were. Grandma always said, Emily shared, with her team, that the true flavor of food isn't just in its ingredients, but in the love and intention with which it's prepared. Today we proved that this love can overcome all barriers, build bridges, and transform lives. Flavors and Senses had become more than an inclusive bakery. It was a symbol that dreams, when nurtured with dedication, perseverance, and love for others, can grow beyond any initial expectation. It was living proof that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness can arise from the most unexpected encounters, and that every person, regardless of their limitations, deserves the opportunity to savor life to its fullest. The end.